Okay, so when I first came across your item for the Irish Times on the alt-right, I had basically entered this space where I would be gotten sort of sick of reading about the alt-right,
Mhm.
because a lot of it seems hyperbolic and uninformed and unnuanced to me, and yours was really a refreshing. Your item was really a refreshing corrective, and then I went and read your Baffler article, which gave sort of built up sort of a foundation for understanding the cultural sectors from which the alt-right sort of arose. So I'm just wondering, before we get into the content of the column, do you also perceive there to be perceive much coverage of the alt-right as such to be generally quite bad or incomplete?
Yeah, it is quite bad. Uh, it tends to just immediately describe it as neo-Nazi, for example, or to just kind of conflate everything that's in there. Um, Now, to some extent, it is also a problem that every time you write about them, you get typically anonymous responses, on Twitter or wherever else, being very like subcultures always are, where they can't stand to be conflated in any way with other tiny subcultures, which to the outside world are very similar to each other. So to some extent, I'm not that sympathetic to their kind of unwillingness to be spoken about in a general way, because it's going to be impossible to talk about them if we can't do that to some extent. But I also see that a lot of what's been written about all these kind of emerging online movements from the right have been total hyperbole, conflating things as different people as different as, say, Milo and Richard Spencer, as if they have the same ideas. Where, I mean, that's clearly not true. And even if you look at the way they speak about each other, they're obviously kind of roughly, they're connected in different ways. They've written about each other and that kind of thing, but they have really fundamental philosophical differences.
Yeah, and one frustration that I encounter or that I've experienced on occasion, and I don't dwell on the alt right. I don't engage with it as much as others and as much as you have. But one thing that I've noticed is that if you seek to establish a differentiation between aspects of the alt right that are conflated,
Mm.
that inevitably engenders pushback that you are somehow excusing the alt-right or giving them undue credence, or you're doing something to absolve them of culpability for the noxious views that they espouse, when in reality you're just trying to be analytically precise, but for some reason there's no there's a lack of willingness to accept a careful parsing of what this is. You're supposed to just issue a wholesale condemnation and leave it at that.
I know, and I can't understand why these people don't realize that they're the reason that this exists. Like the fact that they won't allow, any kind of dispassionate analysis of the right, is part of what has caused so many people to move towards it in the first place. And the completely hysterical way in which they talk about it, with no desire to actually understand it, and just to try to outdo each other in levels of complete hysteria and the way they speak about it, it's not actually doing any good. And in my more kind of ungenerous moments, I think I wonder if they don't even care whether it's doing any good, because they're not actually that interested in changing things politically or in challenging any of this stuff. They just want to individually, increase their public profile on social media, and they don't really care about anything else beyond that. Because if they did, they would be taking it more seriously as, trying to understand its politics and so on.
And do you think that springs from just laziness, or maybe, like you mentioned, or you hinted at, this desire to just um, attain all the social media accolades that you can get?
I think it's the
What is
latter,
the?
honestly.
Yeah,
I really do. I've kind of lost patience with people doing that, because it's, um, it's too late now. You know what I mean? They've done so much damage, and they have no qualms whatsoever about completely shooting down and personally character assassinating anyone who even tries to understand the movement, even from a left perspective.
And have you experienced that yourself?
Absolutely, yeah. Oh, I mean, even the piece I wrote in the Irish Times, I got people sending me kind of screen grabs of some feedback where it was sort of suggested that I was trying to sneak in a sympathetic reading of the alt-right at the end of the article, and that kind of commentary just proved my point at the end of the article, which was, that the kind of enforced intellectual conformity among liberals is actually helping the alt-right.
Yeah, and one objection that I could anticipate from somebody of that disposition, if they were to read your Irish Times column, is, "Oh, you are." So this is what they would say to you. You are you're unfairly tarnishing liberals by associating them somehow with the alt-right, or suggesting that they're equivalent. So this is a false equivalency. This is the big meme that goes around now. Everybody's an expert on logical fallacies for all of a sudden, and they think false equivalence. It's false equivalence to postulate some relationship between two discrepant phenomena. But you're not asserting an equivalence, right? You're just saying that these are compatible, or they sort of come about and gain traction in tandem with one another.
Yeah, I mean, I cannot use language to be any more clear about this. I specifically said they are not comparable. They are compatible. They complement each other. They feed into one another. You only have to look at them to see that they constantly reference one another. So if you go to the right, you see, the kind of extreme, weird end of Tumblr, being shared as evidence of, Western decline and the overreach of feminism and so on. If you go to the other side, you see constant reference to 4chan and the alt-right and so on as evidence that American society is completely racist, and that the right are taking over and so on. So I'm simply saying that they need each other in a way to for their worldview to make sense. But it doesn't matter. I mean, I could have simply printed that paragraph over and over and over again, and they would still say, "But why are you saying they're the same?"
Right. There's no amount of couching or qualification is sufficient. People are just going to extrapolate from that what you say, regardless, because they have. I mean, and that's what they have, sort of an ulterior agenda where they want to absolve themselves of any culpability for anything that's gone wrong with the discourse, so to say. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't matter how much you nuance it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess they can't accept it because then they would have to think about the fact that they might have done something wrong, or that they might have had the wrong approach over the last couple of years.
Yeah, and there's an interesting parallel there, because you see a similar dynamic going on in the U.S. with the Hillary Clinton campaign and the wider Democratic establishmentarian orbit, looking for ways to absolve themselves of responsibility for failing to beat the guy from The Apprentice. And they'll employ a similar tactic where they'll say, they'll deflect by saying, "Look at these horrible forces going out there that have emerged out there in the ether." For you to say that we are in any way, suggest that we are in any way compatible with them or equivalent with them, is to, again, absolve them of culpability. And they take that tack because they don't want to be introspective at all. They don't want to see how their tendencies might have helped give rise to it. And again, if you help to give rise to a phenomenon, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are guilty of enabling the phenomenon. Something has just come about as a result of something you've done. So you should take stock of that.
Yeah, and I change my mind on things all the time. I regularly think, no, I got that a bit wrong, and and then I change. I mean, that's what you should do. It's not always pleasant. I mean, especially if you end up getting into a kind of an online scrap where you realize halfway through that you've got something wrong. You don't want to turn around and say, okay, I was wrong about that. But so I understand the impulse, but I feel like the stakes are kind of high at the moment, so they really should learn to do that. as I said, it's not always pleasant, but you kind of have to do it.
Yeah, and in the column you mentioned, you referenced the quote constant conflations of liberal media hyperbole,
Mm,
um, and something that I've been harping on in other contexts, but I guess in this one as well, is that when this hyperbolic interpretation of things is dominant, especially of right wing phenomenon, that distorts the analytical lens through which you view the phenomenon, and warps your ability to best counteract it.
mm.
So that's why it's worth emphasizing this needless hyperbole, because it actually inhibits one's ability to accurately gauge what the situation is and figure out a
Mm.
way to counteract it.
Yeah, I mean, I think uh, the more I kind of have read into this, the more I've noticed, that a lot of the things that let's say, I mean, I'm using the term alt-right very broadly. People will always nitpick, but I have to use it a little bit broadly in order to be able to refer to it at all. But in the very broad sense, a lot of the their conclusions are wrong, but a lot of the things that they've started off with were things that everyone else was kind of too polite to talk about, or else uh, it just seemed like the territory was too dark or something like that. So a lot of the time they've noticed things that are real, and because they're so outside of the realm of polite discussion, they've kind of followed those ideas to very dark places, and they haven't really had anyone to argue with them because there's no direct connection. Like, they're talking amongst themselves in forums anonymously, so for example, if you read you know um some alt-right stuff and then you want to hear a different argument, like what would be a liberal a rebuttal to that, where are you going to find that? Because they're not, liberals, and we'll say the left is not responding directly to any of the stuff that they're saying. And if, for example, you have a Facebook page, say you're an average like 19-year-old, and you post on your Facebook page, oh, I've just read all these figures about um say whites becoming an ethnic minority in whatever year it will be, something like that, right? I mean, immediately you would be shot down for even asking it. And I don't think that, I understand why people do that, because it is a taboo for a reason, because of just the history of genocide and of where kind of racial thinking has led. But we have to just accept the fact that people who are going into that world and they're reading all of this stuff they have no way of seeing an alternative point of view, because people aren't actually responding seriously to their ideas.
Yeah, and I think when people get this general sense that there's an external imposition on them to refrain from engaging with certain ideas,
Yeah.
they might get this sort of subconscious sense that there might be some hidden validity to the ideas that's being
Absolutely.
withheld from them. So you do need to, they do need to see or have made available to them an active, cogent rebuttal, or just some kind of good faith argumentation, so they don't feel that there's this sort of like slightly sinister attempt to just prevent them from even learning what it is that's being presented. And I think and that's why the liberal hyperbolic reaction to the alt-right can have such damaging repercussions, is because even engaging with the ideas on the merits will be seen in certain liberal circles as an acquiescence to them, or extending some kind of credence to them.
Absolutely. So I think like a lot.
And just to complete the thought, I think there is sort of an emerging field on the more left side of the spectrum to actually begin to engage with the ideas. But among sort of establishmentarian liberal circles, at least in the U.S., it's just beyond taboo. It'll be seen as sort of a vindication of Nazis, and that's really what it's being presented as.
Mm. Yeah, I'm excited to see that actually kind of emerging very much on the American left. a lot of interesting people are kind of starting to talk about those things. I think a lot of people kind of around Jacobin I think that's where kind of these discussions are going to happen and actually be kind of interesting. I guess as well, people on the left, as distinct from liberals, are better positioned to do that because they're used to being outside of mainstream debate, and they're used to, thinking a little bit bigger. Like liberals tend to think the dominant kind of moral code of today is beyond question, and they don't think of themselves as ideological, for example. They just think this is the way it should be, and
they're just apolitical technocrats who wanted to explain the news to you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think the left are in a better position to actually deal with these issues. I mean, and we should do that as well. I mean, it would be such a missed opportunity. Liberals are not going to do it. They can't. I don't think they're intellectually equipped to do it, and I think they're too vain and too. They don't want to get their hands dirty, almost, like even dealing with the subject.
I completely agree, and especially in the U.S., I don't know enough about Irish politics to comment, sadly. But in the U.S., the liberal intelligentsia is so obsessed with these parochial concerns that they'll associate anything related to the alt-right as just with Trump, and Trump is their everyday 24-hour obsession, right? So anything that will be seen as in some way abetting Trump or excusing Trump or absolving Trump, that's end of the world emergency crisis for them, day in and day out. So that kind of inhibits them from engaging with this stuff on any substantive level at all. It's really just a discursive nightmare.
I mean, liberals would, like, when I was saying earlier that sometimes the alt-right start off with a valid criticism, but where they end up is kind of what I disagree with. But for example, a lot of liberal kind of Hillary supporters, like Hillary loyalists, will say, would rather a president who is pro-immigration but also pro regime change and pro-war and so on, than they would a president who is anti-immigration but also against this dreadful policy of repeatedly invading Middle Eastern countries to bring about regime change. Now, morally, that just, or on any level politically, that just doesn't make any sense. That's not actually that's not a virtuous position to take, because what you're saying is bomb them and then let them come in as refugees. How about don't bomb them in the first place? It's like they just don't. It's all about me feeling good.
At the very least, you would need to present an argument for why that is the virtuous position, rather than just presume it and assert it, which is what they do. I mean, they don't feel they have to do the logical work of actually establishing why it is that they have. While they're the sole arbiters of supreme virtue, I mean, they just expect that everybody just knows that what they're trying to, put forward is correct.
Yeah, I mean, I saw a lot of alt-right people sharing, and people on the left at the same time sharing the same image, which was it was the McDonald's arch, and then it said something like McDonald's, a progressive and modern burger company, or something like that. I don't know if you saw that.
I think I saw somebody reference it. I don't know if I actually took the time to look at it, honestly.
But I thought that was interesting. I mean, that everyone was sharing it, or that it was being shared in these different places at the same time. So that suggests to me that, they do have a critique of the way in which a completely uncritical idea of what is progressive has become corporate policy, and has just been uncritically adopted in government, within capitalism, and they're really just, So I mean, obviously, the left's critique of it is going to go to a different place. But they do at least start off by, they can see that the idea that having liberal opinions is somehow dangerous or radical or whatever is bogus. I don't know if you saw Richard Spencer was interviewed on by a Vice journalist. Did you see this?
I think I heard about it. I saw something
Oh.
having to do with it, but I didn't
It's
actually look
worth
at it.
watching. I mean, it was quite painful to watch, because she was not prepared at all for the fact that he has his arguments very well worked out, and she just made some kind of snarky comments about trolling and stuff, and he made an absolute fool of her. But one of the things he said to her was, your ideas of human rights and everyone should do what they want and express themselves and so on challenges no one. It doesn't challenge the government. It doesn't challenge Wall Street. And he's absolutely right. It doesn't. So I think a lot of these people, believe that their ideas are still interesting or difficult or kind of transgressive in some way, when of course they're not.
Yeah, and that's funny. I tweeted just this morning that this controversy du jour with Meryl Streep going to the
Oh, yeah.
Golden Globes and like issuing some denunciation of Trump. I said we should just that's just a good example of a controversy we should probably just ignore.
Yeah.
But I'm going to violate my own rule here and say that actually, I mean, the idea that she was being transgressive or she was saying something that contravened elite norms, or she was doing something that really, rattled people or something. I mean, that's sort of indicative of this mindset that by coming out in favor of what is just accepted pablum in elite liberal spheres is somehow just a transgressive thing, and it's not. And it's obviously going to feed into this backlash where people who have a more systemic critique are going to gain traction on all sides of the spectrum. And you can't counter that effectively if your sole vision is to just marshal some defense of this kind of pat corporatized social liberalism that has no content to it other than to kind of like help give shareholders faith that like the company on whose board they sit is, I don't know, is kind of instituting sufficiently multicultural policies. So it's just it's a really kind of nasty cycle.
Yeah, I mean, somebody like Meryl Streep, doing that. I mean, it's just a dream come true for the Trump supporters. She's just the embodiment of everything they hate.
Yeah, and Meryl Streep, the lovers will. Because they'll think that they're doing something really out there or transgressive by, I don't know, sharing the video or saying "Go Meryl," and everybody kind of, nobody has learned anything.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you an example of I mean, do you watch Sam Hyde? Or
Okay, so this is again another example of something that I've heard about tangentially, but I don't. I don't know enough to comment intelligently on what he's about.
Okay, well, he's the most visible figure in Million Dollar Extreme, who had a TV show on Adult Swim, and there was kind of a hit piece written about them by BuzzFeed, because they discovered that Sam Hyde, the kind of most visible figure, was sympathetic to the alt-right, which he is. But if you look at if you watch something like Sam Hyde, I mean, you can see where, again, like there is some kernel of like a good analysis, a good criticism there, within what he's doing. And the fact that nobody's been willing to kind of, or I suppose the kind of liberal mainstream has not been willing to actually have an open conversation about any ideas of any consequence, you can see why they kind of end up in this forum world where they like go to very dark places, we'll say. But just for example, if you wanted to watch something by him, he did this. He kind of infiltrated TEDx, where he told them that he was like a kind of tech philanthropist in Mogadishu, and made up this. And then he went on stage and kind of trotted out well, I guess a kind of an absurd version of Silicon Valley liberal kind of humanitarian ideology, and it was absolutely brilliant, but watching it, he could have been on the left or the right, like, the critique could have been one or the other. It's only when you find out more about him that you can see he's on the alt-right. But there's clearly the cultural energy right now. The interesting stuff, I think, is happening on the left and the right. It's really the center that is lacking energy, that is dead, that feels like it doesn't have any more ideas.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, and this sort of harkens back to something that you discussed in that Baffler article, kind of tracing the origins of this sort of slightly nihilistic online forum culture, to drawing influence both from the left and the right. And I think, there's obviously, and because there seems to be embedded in it a rejection of mass consumer culture, sort of like an iconoclastic bent. And those aren't things that are really associated with conservatism, at least as traditionally defined. You could probably find strains of conservatism over the ages that might be relevant there, but in broad strokes, those have been mostly seen as sort of left-wing ideals or pursuits. And one of the dangers of this hyperbolic liberal conception of what the alt-right is, and even calling it alt-right in the first place, glosses over the complexity of influences, or the multitude of influences that kind of gave rise to it. And that's why I sort of always put the alt-right in quotation marks, or I don't really want to endorse even the terminology fully. I don't think it captures what it is that exists.
Yeah. I suppose, though, I mean, kind of an avant-garde style, if you think about, if you didn't know that the alt-right existed, alt-right in quotation marks, what would an avant-garde today look like when, people like Lena Dunham are kind of icons of our generation, it's going to look something like Sam Hyde, it shouldn't be that surprising that's what it will look like, so I guess, yeah, I mean, the hyperbole, see, they don't really have the language. I mean, one of the things I wanted to get across in that Baffler piece was that I was reading commentary about the whole beta male thing and 4chan and so on. And it was being described as patriarchal and conservative, which just doesn't make any sense. I mean, it's this totally like, transgressive and very kind of porn fueled, world, like, so, and it's also, single young males who are childless and play video games all day. I mean, how can you describe that as traditionalist or patriarchal or something like that?
They're not going to church.
They can't, exactly. They can't really break out of that. But then, I mean, one of the criticisms I would have of the alt-right, or at least one of the things I think is inconsistent within it, maybe even hypocritical, is that it is actually simultaneously, it's theoretically it has kind of paleo-conservative traditionalist element to it, but its style is like really squalid libertinism, and you can't really be both at once.
Yeah, that is a contradiction there, but again, there's no single ruler of the alt-right or some kind. I mean, the media has tried to appoint certain avatars of the alt-right to like come to, and so that will be a person that they could come to and say, hey, here's a contradiction. You have this libertine ethos, but you're sort of grounded in paleo-conservatism. What say you? But there's no like there's no established spokesperson or anything. So that's when you get into this sort of superficial discussion of who gets to define what the alt right is, and it's one of the reasons I kind of I'm ambivalent about the utility of the term in the first place.
Hmm. Yeah, I suppose it doesn't make sense because you're conflating it all and then saying, why is it inconsistent? But the thing is, you know, the more libertine 4chan kind of end of things has defined the aesthetic of it, so even when you go to the most traditionalist kind of forums and sites and stuff, you'll find imagery that comes from 4chan. So and I just think, like, a lot of them would say, we're the new left. Like, actually Richard Spencer has said that, like, we're like the new left. But I would say, if you had to borrow from the kind of irreverence and fun and all that of the 4chan end of things, which is certainly not traditionalist, then that suggests that your ideas maybe are not what's attracting people. It's more the fun and the imagery and the kind of irreverence that is actually attracting larger numbers. I think that's true.
And if that is true, and I do tend to agree, that would call into question the way that liberals have exalted the alt-right as this formidable political force. I mean, if politics is not the animating sentiment behind why they've gained whatever prominence they've gained, then liberals have kind of erected a straw man.
Yeah, although I'm not sure about this, actually, because up until
I'm not sure either. It's a live issue, and it's like it's not clear cut up in either direction, and so.
Up until recently, like, for example, when Trump was elected and everyone was calling him a fascist, that was totally ridiculous, and and I would still be critical of that. But I think more recently I've started to take seriously the extent to which the hard alt-right will say that the racial kind of white segregationist, like, alt-right that is serious about political ideas and stuff. If you get sucked into that world initially through just like trolling and just like the fun of the more irreverent kind of forums and stuff, you are probably going to be exposed to those ideas, and your hatred of your common enemy, which is sort of Tumblr kind of identity politics or whatever, it is likely to kind of push you in that direction. And I don't know, I actually see those ideas potentially having influence in the future.
Yeah, and I think I agree with that. And I think one reason why they could have influence is because there is not a robust counter argument out there that's accessible to people.
Absolutely, yeah.
But I think a lot of the people who we would associate or conceptualize as alt-right are pretty young.
Yeah.
And if this is their introduction to political theory, even if they came to it before the lulls or for the irreverent side of things, nevertheless, it's going to have a potentially lifelong impact on just how they develop and see the world. So yeah, it's as an entry point. I mean, it could lead, and I think this is probably a conscious strategy within certain factions of the alt-right. They want to lure people in with the lulls and then have that just be an introduction to the more kind of dense theory, and have people just have that be just an excuse to expose people to it who might not otherwise encounter it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some of the ideas that they discuss, which are just off the table everywhere else, they can't be discussed in academia, they can't be discussed, anywhere in polite society, would be things like, and this is a factor that I think has really created, has fueled the alt-right, possibly more than anything else, is that patterns in America in particular, where there's very high divorce where there's a lot of sexual choice, as a result, lower levels of monogamy and that kind of thing. Um, One of the things that it has produced is a kind of sexual hierarchy among men. This actually does bear out in the figures, like where smaller numbers of men are having more sexual partners, and then there's a larger number at the bottom who are having none or very few. And so a lot of the discussion about this in various kind of like red pill and various forums like that has been about how to deal with like being a beta male, like not being at the bottom of the pile. And some of them have gone into like men going their own way, which is the separatist men's movement. Some of them have gone into kind of the pickup artist thing, which has this kind of social Darwinian thing about like how to trick women into liking you.
Yeah.
But once again, though, the thing that they're starting off with is correct. Like they're observing a pattern and they're being told you're not supposed to observe it. So like, what's our answer to that? What's our alternative to that? That's what we have to be discussing.
Right.
How do we analyze the same phenomenon? But don't just say the phenomenon isn't there or you can't discuss it.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think there would be a tendency on the part of just the mainstream media. I don't even know what you call it anymore, just complex, to laughingly dismiss a, say, young man who has had problems meeting women and has psychological issues that stem from that, or has angst based on their inability to find a mate. I mean, I think that should be seen. I think there's a way to acknowledge the legitimacy of whatever kind of anger that might produce, or discontent that might give rise to, without validating the broader kind of framework that can be constructed as a result of that. So, but when somebody who's who say is like, I don't know, 19 years old and is trying to find practical tips for how to find a mate, I mean, that seems perfectly reasonable to me. But what they're being offered is sort of an entry point into this weirder philosophical framework now, with the pickup artist stuff and all the ancillary elements there. But I don't see a pathway that's obviously available that can kind of, I don't know, give them a more productive way forward. I mean, I'm kind of just, does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, on top of that, like if you kind of think of, when I read these forums, like as a woman, they're tough to read because they really are really hateful, and and there's no denying that they're just absolutely full of total hatred of women, and such a dark view of what motivates women and stuff like that. But like it is true that in kind of much more mainstream liberal discourse, hatred of men is much more acceptable. And if
Or
you're a young
mockery, or deal.
yeah, it's more mockery, dismissive mockery, that kind of thing. But like the whole discourse of like man, that prefix man and bro, whatever, right? Which is designed to if you're pro free speech, for example, that is dismissed as like or if you're on the left, it's being dismissed as brocialism and that kind of thing. But really, I mean, the whole man and bro prefix,
Bernie bro.
exactly, yeah, it is used to kind of attack the confidence of men, and I mean, I think the mission of feminism should be about kind of building up women rather than doing that, and I do think, if you're a young man and you were raised by liberal parents, like say in America, if you're raised by liberal parents, and so you have certain, kind of just dominant liberal views about women and so on, And you're seeing this kind of like man bashing going on all the time. Um, and at the same time, you cannot find a partner, like you can, and then at the same time, your economic prospects, like the rest of your generation, are disappearing. And you just put that all together, and it shouldn't be that much of a surprise that a lot of young white straight men, think I'd rather like set up an anonymous profile and troll people and be sort of bad than just get repeatedly slapped in the face like by everyday feminism or whatever. It's not that surprising, really.
Yeah. It's kind of the oldest story in the oldest tale in the book, right? It's the oldest fable ever. But one reason why I found your pieces so refreshing as a corrective, because you seem to have an intuitive understanding of how these online cultures self-organize in a way that I think maybe not even be available to older people. I mean, if you didn't, and it's not to be ageist. I mean, maybe it's possible, but I'm saying it's just a lot more intuitive or natural for somebody who sort of grew up immersed in it in a way, or grew up sort of attuned to how the social aspect kind of functions. And I say that as somebody who myself, when I mentioned this to you earlier, who as an adolescent did spend a lot of time on online forums. I'm not going to mention which ones. It was not 4chan, okay? But it was definitely incredibly male dominated. When a woman would appear on the forum, it'd be like a big event that everybody kind of like stopped everything to acknowledge, right? But at the same time, it was useful because it was developing bonds of friendship with people through a new medium, and some of them I end up being sort of more conventional friends with. Met in real life when meeting in real life was a big deal, maybe like 10 years ago, but that was a result of it. I could just picture somebody who gets some kind of real social utility from engaging on those forums, taking real exception with these exaggerated depictions of it just being dominated totally by neo-Nazi fervor and that kind of thing. I mean, there needs to be a more careful examination of the meaning that those kind of spaces, quote unquote, confers for certain slightly alienated, insulated young men who do find expression in it, and the expression is not all bad. But it is overwhelmingly male. So that just the paucity of female input alone lends itself to false constructions of what motivates females, or and that kind of thing. So does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, my understanding of these things has mostly just come from observing but not taking part for years. And when you're writing about them, I mean, you always have to, like for the Irish Times piece, for example, you have to assume your audience doesn't know a whole lot. So to some extent, it has to be introductory, which is annoying because it always takes half the article just to get the introductory stuff down. And then you have to fit in a lot of more interesting stuff at the end, kind of more analysis. Although I think in that piece, what I was trying to do was, in the bit where I have to explain what it is, I was trying to do it as accurately as possible in a short space of time to show the difference between somebody like Milo and the more extreme alt-right. So, I mean, I guess, yeah, I mean, it just means that the way it has to be written about in the future has to come from some knowledge of it, and has to be willing to actually deal with some of the ideas that come from it. But that's actually a big project. I mean, in some ways, a lot of the stuff that they're writing about, people who don't agree with maybe where the alt-right has taken those kind of ideas, but who want to engage with the things that they're criticizing, kind of have to start that from scratch now, in a way. Like, there are lots of things that were off the table for a very long time that they've raised, and that will be harder to ignore because they're, building up more and more of a profile. And yeah, I just think there aren't that many people around who are kind of equipped to really discuss it.
Yeah. And I think it's still a novel notion that you can apply an academic lens to this kind of thing, and you could devote years of careful study to it. So it's still a very, incipient field in a way. I mean, do you find that just academically, your area of focus now is appreciated as, fully legitimate sort of emerging field of sociology, or however whatever you would place it in, or is it still sort of a hazy thing to broach?
It probably will be. I mean, everyone now wants to deal with this. Like, I'm on a couple of, I've been sort of studying this for years, but I'm on a couple of like internet researcher academic kind of mailing lists, and right after Trump got elected, I saw all these things coming in about the alt-right, like, how do we study them? What do we do? And I remember just thinking, it's not how you collect data that's going to help you here. It's first of all getting over this thing of everything being too taboo to talk about. If you're not willing to get over that, you're never going to say anything interesting about this. You have to seriously consider their ideas, and have some kind of counter argument. I mean, the piece that was published in the Irish Times that my article was a response to, a lot of the other responses to that piece, it was essentially a kind of style piece about the alt-right that didn't really mention the politics. That was really just more talk. Ideas lots of times. It's not the worst thing in the world. But I guess, people are attracted to him. Well, partly because Americans think anyone with an English accent is clever, but also
that is true. I do tend to agree. I'll be honest.
That they are clever.
Well, they sound. I mean, it's true because they exaggerated it back when it didn't need to be exaggerated.
Yes, exactly.
They made it out to be something that it was not. I mean, that's why. There's such myopia in U.S. media, where they sort of formulate their conceptions of politics inordinately on Twitter, which is absurd. But Twitter is where these people sort of flourished and made their presence most known. So it sort of became reified. It became thing, and the trolling tactics sort of worked.
Yeah, there's an economic basis for this too, which is that obviously the newspapers are having trouble, surviving. And so you have people sitting at their desk desperately trying to come up with a story. And it has to be a story that's going to get as many hits as possible. So they see something happening on Twitter and they can just write it up, So now you have newspaper articles about a tweet, and the newspapers are desperately trying to chase social media, to be seen, to keep on top of things. So they are inflating stuff, but I don't know what to do about that. I mean, because if newspapers are struggling and they can't afford to send, like back in the day, they would send, a foreign correspondent, across the world, and they would spend a week writing a report and stuff, I mean, now it's like somebody at BuzzFeed desperately trying to come up with the thing that's going to get the most hits possible. So it has to be like a youth culture thing, and it has to show itself to be, progressive and keeping with the times and all that.
Yeah, it's a really destructive cycle. Okay, well, I think this was a conversation. People agree. I'm just going to go read your articles that will be linked in the YouTube description, and looking forward to see what you come up with.
Okay, thanks. Nice to
All
talk
right.
to you.
Bye.